So welcome everybody. I know that we just met last week where we had a rousing conversation with Beth Mormino, but we are back here for the Rec Colloquium series at the BU ADRC. And it is my pleasure to introduce someone I've known for a little bit of time now, Ganesh Babulal, who is an assistant professor of neurology at the Washington University School of Medicine. He's also an investigator at the Knight ADRC, a faculty scholar in the Institute for Public Health, and he's the co-director of the DRIVES Lab. Ganesh is the PI on several studies funded by NIA and NIH in general, as well as some nonprofit organizations. Dr. Babulal is the current chair of the Diversity and Disparities Professional Interest Area of the Alzheimer's Association's iStart. His work focuses on the relationship between cognitive function and mental health in the daily functioning as reflected in instrumental activities of daily living. Additionally, his research and expertise lie in the assessment of how social determinants of health, including discrimination, racism, and chronic stress, impact health and well-being in aging and underrepresented ethnoracial groups. Dr. Babulal, it is a pleasure to have you here. I'm so glad that you can make it. Please feel free to take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. It's my pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad you were able to for what I hope will be an interesting set of topics. So I do want to thank Dr. Jackson and Dr. O'Connor for the invitation to discuss some neurobehavioral markers of decline, but also looking at the intersectionality between Alzheimer's disease and social determinants of health. So nothing super exciting here, just my my disclosures in terms of my research support. So the flow of this talk will sort of mirror an hourglass. I plan to start off with a little dive on the literature on social determinants of health, race, and Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And then I'll reduce it down to a single construct that we've been working on over the past 5, actually more like 7 years, and then examine that through different studies that we've done. And I do want to qualify that this is a very expansive topic that really 45 or 50 minutes just doesn't do justice to. But we'll first start off with some definitions of frameworks and then transition into sort of the state of disparities within aging, and then examine application within ADRD. And then I'll talk about our work as using driving as a neurobehavioral marker of global function and cognitive decline. And then at the very end, if I have a little bit of time, I'll present on a new hopeful study that we have currently under review, which I think will help to expand the current focus of our work, but also I'm hoping the field at large. So social determinants of health are really the conditions in which we live, learn, work, and play. These are environmental, social, economic factors that powerfully influence health outcomes for the entire population. Many people assume that health is sort of individually centered and seeing that a physician may support and preserve health, but we know that it's estimated that medical care itself, healthy behaviors along with genes and biology altogether only account for about half of a society's overall health outcomes. The other half is really made up of those social determinants of health that either provide or limit opportunities for health. Now, when a society's principles and policies are actually working to promote social determinants of health, health is then created at the level of the individual, the community, the environment, and society at large. But when any combination of these conditions are lacking, the gene that powers total health starts to break down, resulting in significant health inequities, actually including life expectancy, mortality, well-being, disability, and other functional limitations. So the model I'm presenting here is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. Most models usually encompass the red boxes that I've highlighted, but this model from them actually adds in food, which in my opinion, is sort of an important facet for the survival of most species. So I want to briefly touch on health disparities. I'm sure you've all had a lot of great content where you are right now at Boston University. So this is nothing new. As a concept, it is a neologism that was coined in the early 1990s. It rose as an explanation for why worse health outcomes were greater among socially disadvantaged people, but in particular, members of disadvantaged and racial ethnic groups. The Department of Health and Human Services actually launched Healthy People 2020 in the year 2010, which really expanded a little bit on health disparity. And they defined it as this, that it was health difference that adversely affected groups of people who have been systematically experiencing greater social or economic obstacles to health based on their racial or ethnic group, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, age, mental health, and then it also expands into cognitive, sensory, physical disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. But more importantly, that definition was centered on the facet that these were historically linked to discrimination and or inclusion. Now, within the field of gerontological research and inquiry, aging in place is really considered this affirming and positive construct like well-being and quality of life. However, it's important to consider for a large portion of our population, they're not really aging in place, but rather stuck in place, particularly in environments that are detrimental to their health, their quality of life, and well-being. And at the bottom, I list really a number of outcomes with the arrows, going up and down in terms of greater exposure and reduced access. But we know that increases in stress, exposure to environmental pollutants, personal crime, limited access to medical care, recreation, these all really impact not only healthy aging, but also the ability to age in a form or fashion that's conducive to the individual's well-being. So while a reduction in health disparities really signal this shift towards equity, I'd like to argue that it's not enough. What we really need to do is start off with a health equity framework in our minds when designing, assessing, performing clinical evaluations, and also treatments. So the figure that I have up here is from the National Vital Statistics System. And it's one on life expectancy from the year 2006 to 2017. And it provides it for both race and ethnicity in the United States. Overall, and not very shockingly, females tend to typically have higher life expectancy compared to males. And non-Hispanic whites tend to have higher life expectancy compared to the other groups. But there is one noteworthy observation. Male and female Hispanics actually have a higher life expectancy compared to the respective gender of the other two groups. But also, most strikingly, as you'll see, non-Hispanic Black males tend to have the lowest life expectancy at 71.5 years. So these pie charts are also from the Health Vital Statistics System. What they represent is really the percent distribution of the top 10 leading cause of death across age groups in the United States. And these facts or these figures were from 2017. There are a few notable patterns that I do want to highlight. So heart disease in the blue actually steadily rises from teenage and young adulthood years, all throughout adulthood into the oldest age group. Cancer in the light blue, there's actually an ebb and flow pattern from it, decreasing from younger age to about teenage and young adulthood. But then you start to see a rapid increase from adulthood until age 65, where it starts to attenuate. Stroke in the off purple color is relatively small in the younger age groups, but it does increase from age 45 onward. And last but not least, the one I want to talk about is Alzheimer's disease, which really comes onto the radar at around age 65 or so, and it increases over the next decades. And for those of us working in Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, we know that age is the single biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And really, there is an underlying pathobiological process that begins many decades before the age of 65. So one more last figure to sort of inundate you with. This one, again, from the same statistics system, it really depicts the age-adjusted data for the leading causes of death from the year 1958 to 2017. So quite a large swath in terms of the decades. There are a select number of leading causes across the ICD versions, and I should note that I don't believe ICD version 11 is on here just because of its recency. But what I do want to point out is there are various conditions, so specifically cardiovascular disease, which includes coronary heart disease, myocardial infractions, and heart failure. But in addition to that, cerebrovascular disease like stroke and aneurysms have steadily been decreasing. And this is likely due to better care, preventative medicine, and public health initiatives. Diseases like hypertension actually have more of a parabolic curve, which is likely due to increases in obesity. But others like Alzheimer's disease are seeing an exponential growth, largely due to the aging population, but more importantly, I think, due to a lack of disease-modifying treatments and also preventative measures. So with that said, I'll dive into sort of the state of aging in Alzheimer's disease. So I'm sure you're all quite familiar with these facts and figures. We know right now there's about 5.8 million older adults, that is defined as age 65 and older, living in the United States with AD. 2/3 of those are women, and it is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. We know that older Black adults are twice more likely to have Alzheimer's disease, while older Hispanic adults are about 1.5 times more likely to have AD. But what we do know is both groups are they're less likely to receive a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now, where I think this the rubber meets the road is by the year 2050. We know that there's going to be roughly a doubling of the older adult population to about 88 million. But also there's going to be an almost tripling of the cases of Alzheimer's disease to about 14 million. For the economists in the audience, this is figures I think quite jarring, but we know that the cost of healthcare for Alzheimer's disease will rise from $259 billion in 2017 dollars to 1.1 trillion in, again, 2017 dollars. But more importantly, this is going to result in a 4-fold increase on Medicare, Medicaid, and out-of-pocket expenses. But more importantly, what is not captured on here is that individuals from communities that are underserved will face the brunt of it, because they typically are the ones that are providing caregiving that is unpaid for their loved ones, their family members, and their friends at home. And they really never hit these statistics. So I'll dive into a little bit into biomarker studies. Biomarkers are quite exciting. As Dr. Jackson mentioned, I think Dr. Moramino presented last week, and I'm sure talked quite a bit about imaging and the modalities. There's not a lot, though, with respect to imaging in terms of diverse populations, but I know there are a number of national initiatives currently working right now to help improve representation within the field. But CSF has been collected for quite a few years, more than the recent advances in PET imaging. And over the past decade, there have been a number of biomarker studies that have really just controlled for race and ethnicity within their analyses. Most of them, again, as I mentioned, using cerebrospinal fluid. And in terms of the comparison, they're typically between non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. And what they found was that there's really no differences in terms of amyloid, which is a key protein for driving the pathophysiology. But for tau and phosphorylated tau, 2 additional analytes, those tend to be much higher in whites compared to African Americans. And this relationship was true both for groups that had normal cognition, but more importantly for those that had mild cognitive impairment or a clinical dementia rating greater than 0. And so this does not really kind of make sense, especially comparing to the prior statistics where we know that those 2 other populations compared to whites tend to have a higher prevalence. So you would expect for African Americans to be twice the risk for Alzheimer's disease. They would have more abnormal level of disease biomarkers, but a biological explanation for this difference really isn't clear. But what we do know is within all of these studies, there are considerable differences in terms of the sample size. For African Americans, they're usually a lot smaller, but also there's selection bias that needs to be considered because these participants tend to not be representative of the larger population. For example, some of these studies do include participants if they've had a stroke, if they've had heart attack, depression, renal failure. So pretty much all the noise that sort of gives the richness to the population is filtered out. But it's important to start to measure these because these are represented within larger epidemiological studies. So I'm going to drill into a little bit of the data from a number of cohorts that have been published over the years. None of this are my own work, but I just want to present it because I think they're critical and important for understanding the state with respect to disparities within ADRD. So the data to the upper left-hand corner are from the Chicago Health and Aging Project, also known as CHAP. It is a longitudinal population-based cohort of older adults residing in the south side of Chicago. The top table presents odds ratio for predicting cognitive impairment 18 years before a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease using a neuropsychological battery. And as you can see, as the time gets closer to diagnosis, the odds ratio increases, and they're about 2 times higher for whites compared to blacks. However, what I do want to clarify is that this does not necessarily mean whites have a much higher likelihood of Alzheimer's disease, because the temporal course of those cognitive change may be different for both education quality, which we know for a fact impacts cognitive function. And I don't believe that was teased apart, at least within that study. Now, the figure right in the middle used the same exact cohort. On the x-axis are years, and on the y-axis is a cognitive composite score. And what they found was while Black older adults performed worse than whites on a Z-score, global measure of cognition, there were no differences with respect to the rate of cognitive decline between the two groups across the 5-year span. But rather, the differences in the y-intercept were explained by years of education, where within the white group, they had on average 2 more years of formal education. And within that same paper, the authors also examined the relative risk for predicting those that developed Alzheimer's disease. And what they found was that Black participants were twice more likely compared to whites to have both all-cause dementia and also specifically Alzheimer's disease. So that's in a cohort of living individuals. Let's go on to the other side of the fence in terms of looking at some pathology data. The study to the left assessed pathology in a 2-to-1 match between Black and white participants enrolled in a memory clinic. Again, this is using the CHAP cohort, or actually, I believe the Mars cohort. They were matched on age at death, sex, years of education, and cognition near death. And what they found was that the Black participants were more likely to have Alzheimer's disease, mixed pathology, compared to the whites who had more vascular comorbidities. They had, in addition to the mixed pathology, they had more vascular comorbidities like atherosclerosis. So this figure to the right really represents data from the Alzheimer's Disease Center at the University of California, Davis. They controlled for age, gender, education, and APOE4 status, and also recruitment source. And what they found was that AD pathology was much lower in the Hispanic participants. But those same participants had a greater mixed pathology or cardiovascular disease alone compared to the white participants. And similar to the study by Dr. Barnes and colleagues, Black participants again had more mixed pathology and cardiovascular disease compared to whites. So we've got the added benefit of the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center. So these tables are from NAC, and specifically their neuropathology data set, which again were collected at 32 past and present Alzheimer's Disease Center. The figure to the left found that compared to whites, Blacks had higher Braak stages and CRAD scores for neuritic and diffuse plaques, which are both more often associated with Alzheimer's disease pathology. And they also more often met the NIA-Reagan and CRAD neuropathological criteria for Alzheimer's disease. And the figure to the right showed that after adjusting for age at birth, education, sum of boxes, the Black participants more likely to have neuropathological Alzheimer's disease than whites. Now, when APOE status was added to that same model, the effect was not significant. But what I did want to point out, because I actually read the paper, that the model to the right, there was about 32% missing APOE4 data for the Black participants and 18% missing for whites. And they didn't do anything to adjust for that. So, but I think the consensus is that there is a greater burden of AD pathology placed on African Americans compared to Caucasians or non-Hispanic whites. So these slides are going to focus on a slightly different aspect of aging, but more on learning and education. So the slide To the upper left-hand portion, had 500 older Black adults without dementia at baseline in the Minority and Aging Research Project. Region of birth and residence at age 12 was examined to see whether or not that impacted baseline cognitive function at older age. And approximately 65% of the sample lived in the South at age 12. And what they found was that Southern birth, along with attending a desegregated school, was associated with a lower baseline cognitive function compared to Northern birth. But there was no difference with regards to change over time. And one explanation for this is that, potentially the attendance in a desegregated school was associated with worse global cognitive functioning attributed to discrimination, stress, and those two might serve as potential mediators for poor functioning in the mid-1950s. The next study to the right-hand corner of the screen is from the YCAP cohort, or the Washington Heights Inwood Columbia Aging Project in New York City. Participants were assessed at baseline and followed anywhere from 1 to 2 years, and they received medical, neurological, and nurse psych assessments. Approximately 900 participants were included if they self-reported literacy status, if they had 4 years or less of formal education, to reduce the confounding effects of lifetime education on acquired literacy. And what they found was that participants who were illiterate were 3 times more likely to have dementia at baseline. And those same participants were twice more likely to convert to dementia over time compared to those who were literate. And these effects were rather quite strong because they adjusted for a whole cadre of variables like years of education, sex, childhood, SES, cardiovascular risk composite, and nationality. And I think what it shows is that literacy affords engagement in social and cognitively engaging activities that can reduce the risk of dementia. Now, in that same YCAP cohort, a more recent paper found that examined trends in cognitive trajectories to see if a later birth year was associated with cognitive decline across different groups. And what they found was that participants that were born later, so from 1921 to 1935, they had a much higher baseline cognitive ability and experienced less decline over time. And this was consistent for the total sample, but more importantly, it was also consistent across race and ethnicity with little asterisks. Because when they actually then divided the sample to look between higher performers and lower performers, they found that the higher performers actually drove the effect. But there was also a diminishing trend where the white participants had higher benefits, there were smaller benefits for the Black participants, and no difference for the Hispanic participants. So an important aspect that I think, in my own humble opinion, is really under research, but it's certainly coming on the radar and being included in a lot of prospective studies, but discrimination. So I'll present a few studies before transitioning into a wrap up into this first section. So the figure to the table to the left-hand portion of the screen is HRS data on the health retirement study, where Sutton and colleagues found that weight discrimination was associated with a 40% increased risk of developing dementia over a decade of follow-up. So what they found was that weight discrimination, being discriminated because of your weight, was independent of BMI as a risk factor for dementia. And so we know that obesity within middle age has got this really interesting effect where it is a risk factor for dementia, but if you're overweight or obese in older age, it's actually associated with a less risk of dementia. This particular study included over 12,000 adults, equating to about 89,000 person years. And over that 10-year follow-up, 9% of the sample developed dementia. And the key point, I think, here is that discrimination alone contributed to that increased risk of dementia within that group. In the CHAP cohort, the Chicago Health and Aging Project, in a sample of about 4,000 older adults, they found that perceived discrimination actually was, when examined, as 2 different factors, both unfair treatment and also personal rejection. Unfair treatment, which encompassed rudeness and unfairness, while personal rejection captured more demeaning overt actions like insults, Black older adults actually reported more instances of unfair treatment and personal rejection compared to their white cohorts over time. And I apologize for this next figure. It's a bit of a handful to take in, but the study to the right by Zidone and colleagues used again HRS data to examine psychosocial pathways on longitudinal cognitive outcomes. Both of those two figures are actually structured equation modeling pathways that have, or they present both direct and indirect effects on baseline memory and memory change. And within these analyses, age, sex, education, income, wealth, comorbidities, and stroke, I believe, were all controlled for. In the top figure, it compared white participants to Black participants, and what they found was that Black participants reported more discrimination, experiencing more perceived discrimination. But what they also found was that discrimination indirectly predicted greater depressive symptoms, led to worse memory, and it also indirectly predicted a greater external locus of control, which then predicted lower memory. But more importantly, outside of these two mediator pathways, discrimination itself directly predicted worse memory in terms of performance over time. Interestingly enough, in the figure right below, comparing Hispanics to the non-Hispanic cohort, there was no effect of perceived discrimination, had no effect on memory or performance for the Hispanic participants. So a lot of data. I apologize, and I went really quick through it, but with regards to, I think, the state of science of within diverse populations in ADRD, there's still a lot that needs to be done, and I'm sure you all are quite aware of that. There needs to be increased representation. We know that disparities do continue to be prominent within racial and ethnic groups, and they extend into virtually all facets of our aging continuum. AD will continue to increase in prevalence and differentially impact marginalized population and those that are underserved. Likewise, there is a greater likelihood of cardiovascular and cerebrovascular pathologies within African American and Hispanics. Cognitive function, I think this point is quite important. There are differences in cognitive function, but those are actually likely due to where you start, which is different from capacity. And so early childhood education is really being stressed on, and its impact on the aging spectrum itself. And I know that recently last year, the Lancet Commission on Dementia added that in within their model as one of those modifiable risk factors. There is some emerging evidence with regards to CSF biomarkers, but it's still, I think, a little bit compromised in terms of trying to make any appropriate determination on where the risk lies, or are there any actually true differences. Discrimination itself is a significant risk factor for a number of health outcomes. And lastly, I think new longitudinal studies are beginning to adopt this life course approach, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to transition a little bit and pivot back to this figure from the Kaiser Family Foundation. But what I want to focus on is really the transportation construct within the neighborhood and physical environment domain. When we think about transportation, it's obvious, typically and obviously thought about as this unidimensional activity that gets us from point A to point B. But we certainly know that it's much more than that, especially here in the United States. It's got an impact in terms of your access to education, all the way from pre-K to post-secondary levels, to your access to foods, with regards to quality, type, and quantity. Your community and social participation, including leisure, religious functions, visiting friends and family, recreation, access to healthcare, more importantly, quality of healthcare, and also the availability of certain services. I think we're seeing that even more highlighted now with the ongoing pandemic. But more importantly, I think employment too, which for most of us occupies about 4 to 7 decades of our lives. But transportation, I think when it is obstructed or diminished, it does have a negative impact in virtually every dimension. And this is especially important in the aging population and Alzheimer's disease. And this is some of the research that I do. So really quick, driving itself represents the ultimate cognitive task. It's a dynamic and sustained deployment of the motor system, the sensory, cognitive, and the emotive systems simultaneously all working in concert. We do know that older adults are driving much longer and logging a lot more miles on the road. More importantly, too, they're remaining in the workforce for a much longer period of time. They're not traditionally retiring at age 65. Age-related decline in disease does impact one's ability to drive, from obvious conditions like epilepsy and stroke to less obvious like dementia. Older adults are also at a much higher risk of injury and mortality. And based on 2015 data from the CDC, we know that on a daily basis, roughly 19 older adults are killed and 712 are injured in a crash. And that includes whether they are the cause of it or they were implicated, due to another party. And finally, we know that the converse or the flip side of the coin is that driving reduction and driving cessation typically leads to a higher rates of depression, faster rate of institutional entry and also care, and then social isolation and morbidity. So big apologies beforehand. This is a lot of words. So apologize for the word vomit, but a lot of work has been done looking at the dangers of dementia and driving. And what I want to talk about is sort of the path leading up to where we are right now in 4 studies that we completed. And I'll whip through them really quickly just to give you sort of the main takeaway. In the upper left-hand corner, we conducted a literature review to examine if there were really any differences between race and ethnicity among older adults on driving outcomes. And we only found 18 studies that met our inclusion and exclusion criteria. There were no direct comparisons between groups, but race and ethnicity were treated as covariates within all of these studies. But what we found was that Black older adults had a higher risk for driving reduction and driving cessation, but also mobility restriction after giving up the keys. So we then pivoted to examine a number of outcomes that really looked about planning for driving cessation and alternative transportation in older adults. The sample that we pulled from were from 2 registries. The first was the Claude D. Pepper Older American Independence Center in Michigan, and then the Healthier Black Elders Center in Michigan. In the study in the lower left, we found that e-hail, or more commonly known as ride sharing, it's really not relied upon as a means for transportation among older adults. This was quite evident when about 1.7% of the sample reported ever using e-hail, and about 3/4 of the sample had no knowledge of it. The study in the upper right-hand portion of this screen shows really a significant reliance upon driving for those that are 65 and older. And really, there's this anticipated dependence upon it. So we asked 2 questions. What age did our sample expect to live to, and what age did they expect to stop driving? More than 3/4 of the sample reported that they would expect to drive 1 year after they had died, and 14% reported they had expected to drive 12 years after they had died. And so it wasn't an issue with mathematics, them being able to track, I answered this question this way, and then I therefore need to factor it in to answer it this way. But what it really stressed was the expectations to driving are so critical and important. It's a means to independence. And finally, in this study in the lower right-hand portion, we found that higher stress and lower confidence in driving ability were predictors in those that actively plan to retire from driving. But neither age or sex were actually significant predictors, because we know that women typically tend to give up the keys more faster than men. But what we found is lower income and also being Black independently predicted more planning, not less planning. And so really the strength of some of these studies, or particularly the last 3 studies that I quoted, was that we had a large sample of older African Americans within them. So I'll transition to some of the work that was conducted here at the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and Washington University. So we know that Alzheimer's disease impairs driving performance. The survival curve on the upper left-hand corner shows really the impact of symptomatic Alzheimer's disease on road test performance. As you can see, compared to the cognitively normal older adults, those are indicated by a CDR of 0. Those with a CDR of 0.5, which equates to roughly about very mild dementia, or 1 equates to about mild. Both of those groups were much faster to fail a road test and within those clearly delineated curves compared to those that were CDR 0. So there's this beautiful stepwise effect showing the importance of increasing pathology on dysfunctional activities. Now, autopsy studies in the late 1990s showed that older adults who were killed in crashes actually had more plaques and tangles at postmortem. And so this led us to start thinking about, perhaps decline during the latter years and examining driving during the preclinical stage of Alzheimer's disease. Um, we know that a lot of trials and studies do focus on cognitive outcomes like screens and neuropsych tests, but there's really little work looking at a complex activity, more a functional activity like driving. And so this notion led us to think about driving itself perhaps as a functional marker or a neurobehavioral marker. And so we sort of situated our research at the intersection of the overlapping field with respect to aging, driving, and Alzheimer's disease. So before we still a little bit more of a preamble before we dive into the really exciting prospective studies. In this study, we examined if the measurement of CDR status, but also CSF biomarker status at baseline could predict driving cessation. And among 559 participants who were followed up to 24 years, we found there was, again, this really nice stepwise curve, that the survival curves show that the CDR0 group had the longest driving time in years. But as the CDR increased again, there was a diminishing number of years, indicating a much faster time to driving retirement. Our Cox models did adjust and test for, of course, the effects of age, gender, education, race, and ApoE4 status. When we tested a subset of those that did have CSF biomarker data, we found that the ratios of tau and p-tau over A beta 42, those were actually a statistically significant predictor of a faster time to driving cessation over 17 years of follow-up. And roughly the hazards ratio equated to about a 10-fold risk for those with a CDR0 and abnormal AD biomarker compared to those that were CDR0 with no, with a normal, quote unquote, normal biomarker level. So in our own cohort of cognitively normal older adults, again defined as a CDR of 0, we prospectively analyzed the associations between preclinical Alzheimer's disease and driving performance on a road test. And so for clarification, our participants used a four-door sedan to navigate a fixed course where they started from a close parking lot and progressed eventually into more complex driving situations, like taking an unprotected left-hand turn. The road test lasts anywhere from about 30 to 45 minutes. There is an evaluator who sits in the front seat with them and grades them, marking both errors on the test, but also a global score delineated as either passing, marginal, or a fail. In the study to the left, what we found was that individuals with more higher or abnormal CSF, both T and P ratios, or amyloid PET, and at that time we're using the mean cortical binding potential for PET. Those with more abnormal biomarkers actually had a greater number of driving errors. They made about 2.5 times more errors on that road test compared to those with more lower levels. But there were no group differences with respect to a neuropsychological composite score. And in the study to the right, we found that higher values of CSF biomarkers, again, both T ratio and P ratio, that actually predicted a much faster time to marginal or fail rating on the road test. And as you can see, the hazard ratios, they're roughly from 5 to 6, which is quite significant, especially for a population that is slated to be cognitively normal. Similar to the prior study, there was no difference with respects to driving behavior, self-reported driving behavior, or on a neuropsychological composite. So the abundance of really biomarkers affords us an enriched perspective to look at AD pathology. In the study to the left, we used the trichotomous scale from Sperling's 2011 paper to examine whether or not baseline tau and amyloid PET imaging predicted subsequent driving performance. Given the small sample size, we had to combine stages 0 and 1 into a single group and compare those to stage 2. But what we found was that among our CDR0 older adults, those with both cerebral amyloid and also tau pathology, they were 11 times more likely to receive a marginal or fail rating on the road test compared to those with either pathology or neither pathology. And in the study to the right, we used the ATN framework to categorize about 126 participants, all against CDR0, on established cutoffs with about 5 years of follow-up data. And what we found was that those with Alzheimer's disease, or the solid red line, were over 3 times faster to receive a marginal or fail rating compared to the normal group. And again, there were no differences with respect to a neuropsychological composite score. So Where am I going with this? Up until now, I've really only been talking about measuring driving performance on a road test. It's the traditional metric for assessment, and it has been for decades, but there are a number of limitations, including it being a controlled condition, both with the car and also the route. The test really can't be replicated elsewhere. So, for example, I can't take the WashU test and drop it, into Boston. It's virtually impossible. It would have to be adapted to the city itself. Um, and outside of have to be normed at that particular location, the test itself can elicit performance anxiety, or conversely, the Hawthorne effect, where participants may overperform compared to what they might without someone watching. Driving simulators, on the other hand, another metric. So while the prior might be a gold standard, this would be the silver standard. Again, a controlled setting. You can maintain driver safety and also support a lot of intervention work. But there are a number of limitations, specifically concerning ecological validity, because it is simulation. There are variations across software versions that are used. More importantly, there are variations in terms of the simulator makes and also the model. But lastly, older adults typically are at a much higher risk for simulator sickness. So unless you don't want emesis on your $100,000 or $1 million driving simulator, it may not necessarily be the best to use. Now, over the past decade, research really has produced sensors and cameras that can capture volumes of data inside and external to a vehicle. But those really systems are expensive in terms of hardware. They require many man hours to fully install or to remove from a vehicle. And there's also a risk of behavior modification, because they're present within the vehicle, you're being watched. Now, thankfully, leaps in telecom and telemetrics have sort of pushed innovation to create tools that can capture high volume of data while remaining fairly inconspicuous. And these devices are known as data loggers. Many of you may be familiar with them because they're used quite liberally with the insurance companies. I had a distinct experience of using Progressive Snapshot about 7 years ago at the end of my monitoring period. The 4-mile daily road trip that I made from home to work actually increased my premium. Needless to say, Flo and her little price gun wore off quite quickly. But when I asked why they increased my price, they said it was a proprietary algorithm. And honestly, I didn't think it was all the drag racing I did next to WashU in my '98 Nissan Maxima, but to be expected. So we actually had to develop our own algorithm, and I'll dive into that a little bit here. So over the past 6 years, we've actually modified a commercial off-the-shelf commercial off-the-shelf device that we plug into a participant's vehicle. The participants come to the ADRC. We plug it into their vehicle, and it has to be 1996 or newer. It immediately accesses the available satellites and then starts transmitting data using now actually 4G. It was previously on the 3G network. And then it transmits that in real time to IT storage in San Jose, California, who then sends it over to our research infrastructure services. And then we're able to get that data on a daily basis wrapped up. And so what we get on a daily basis, anytime a participant starts their vehicle, the device starts recording data. And we get a breadcrumb. A breadcrumb represents at every 30 seconds a particular latitude, longitude, date, and timestamp. And from there, you can actually extrapolate and look at the number of trips, the number of miles, number of unique destinations across a single trip, across days, across weeks, across months, across years. You get the idea. Additionally, there are some adverse events it records if they do occur. So these are event-based triggers. That's speeding, hard braking, sudden acceleration, and of course, major and minor impact. And what we are able to do using GIS technology, in the figure to the left, we've got 5 different participants. They collected data over the course of 5 months for each of them. And each of those polygons represent the total area that they drove in relation to the star, which denotes their home. And what you can see is that there is some variation to, across participants like A and E. For participant C, there's not a lot of change over the course of 5 months. And they actually had 2 stars, and we thought, what the heck was going on? Because we only knew about one of them. Turns out they had another home, and there was a lot of back and forth between the 2 of them. But the figure to the right, what we can do is also look at the trips that occur outside of their home. And again, this is over 5 months worth of data for one participant. You can see most of their trips are made within that 5-mile diameter, not a lot made within that 12 miles, and then only one trip over the course of those 5 months were made outside of that 10-mile diameter. And so we've aptly named this data collection system the Driving Real-World In-Vehicle Evaluation System. It took about half a year to come up with that acronym, because you need a cool acronym when you're doing research. I'll quickly talk about some data that are more recent. So the two studies here are really quite important because they examine non-spatial data from the chip. We looked at a number of driving behaviors that were captured by the drives in a very small sample, 10 older adults with higher levels of beta amyloid, and also 10 with lower levels to look at the key differences. They're all age matched and followed for 1 year. That's the figure to the left, and all of them are CDR0. And in the study, what we were able to see is there were no statistically significant results. But what we did start to see were trends where the preclinical AD positive group started driving less, but they were logging more miles, they had less trips per night, and a lower number of adverse driving events like hard braking, sudden acceleration, or speeding. So you're starting to build a pattern. So fast forward 2 years later, the study to the right, we continue to collect data again on the same 20. We actually have it on 300, but they were the focus because they had the longest period of data. Both these three curves are actually their lowest curves that depict change over time in 3 different driving behaviors using linear mixed models. And as you can see, there's really no big differences at baseline, but over time, the PIB positive group, those with more amyloid, they tend to decrease how often they drove in terms of how many months per day. They typically tend to have a lower number of trips made within the 1 to 5 mile radius. And then those with preclinical AD actually had a faster decline in their overall driving behavior within their environment. We are actually still collecting data in the pandemic. The great thing about this particular methodology is it's a bit pandemic proof because you set it and you forget it. Participants tend to really forget that it's actually there. This was published just on roughly about 4 months of data at the start of the pandemic to look at driving, both pre-pandemic and then during the course of it. And so we're still collecting that. But I'll quickly orient you to these 2 figures here. Let's see, in figure 8, COVID cases are in black and gray in Missouri and in Illinois, and the vertical dashed lines in varying colors indicate different closures of school stay-at-home orders for both Missouri and Illinois. Figure 8 has the percentage of driving made each day in blue within 2019 in the dash, and also in 2020 it's in the solid. And as you can see, there's really a marked decrease from March through mid-April 2020. And figure B has the mean number of trips in green, and also the miles per trip in pink. There are notable decreases in terms of both driving behaviors, suggesting that our older adults are actually sheltering in place and social distancing. We did find that women actually reduced their driving behavior more than men, but there was no relationship with driving demographics or any of the medical risk factors that are associated with a greater risk for having or for being exposed to COVID and actually having the disease itself. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so I am going to quickly talk about a very recent study where we actually wanted to see what if driving behavior could predict preclinical Alzheimer's disease, and simply just using a number of metrics that we collect from the drives chip. And long story short, we were able to find some really remarkable AUC curves, or area under the curves. So for these sets of figures, the first sets of figures here, A through C. In A, you have CSF tau over A beta 42. B, you've got p tau over A beta 42, and C is amyloid imaging. What we found is that within the participants that had the highest 10% or more abnormal, most abnormal biomarker within those 3 areas, the drives variable alone yielded an AUC ranging from 0.71 to 0.82. And then when we added age, ApoE4, and 4 brief neuropsych measures, we saw an increase in the AUCs from 0.87 to 0.90. So quite remarkable. And then we started to ratchet down, the demarcation within the group. And so this is data for the highest top 25%. And similarly, we saw that the drives variable alone were able to predict roughly about from the AUCs were from 0.64 to 0.72. And in addition to the age, APOE4, and also the neuropsychs, we saw the AUCs bump up to 0.88. And there was a similar trend again, where we literally used the median split within our cohort to see. And so there is some credence to the fact that we could potentially use driving itself as a neurobehavioral marker. And so our goal, perhaps, and it's a bit lofty in the future, but we hope that, let's say, for example, you've got a loved one or family member who's driving and you're, really not sure if they're safe to be on the road. You can go to your primary care physician or just really a regular office, chip their vehicle. Data is collected over a predefined period of time. It's then curated, fed into an algorithm, processed using our data and GIS visualization technique, and then run through a risk algorithm assessment where we put them at either a low risk, medium risk, or high risk. And then that information is really conveyed back to their team. So neurologists, PCP, their therapists, neuropsychologists, to really render do they stop driving completely, take away the keys, and then hopefully have a number of other options to take over? Do you continue to monitor to see whether or not there are changes? We know seasonality is an important one. More importantly, date and time, and with regards to night and day impacted, or do they continue to drive? So last slide, I promise. So I'm sure many of you are well acquainted with these curves. They depict the time course of preclinical and symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. Normal to abnormal is situated on the y-axis, while time course is on the x-axis. Changes in amyloid typically arise about 15 to 20 years before cognitive impairment. 5 to 10 years for tau, and about 5 years or less for neurodegeneration with respect to cognitive impairment. Our current working model right now is we're putting that driving as a neurobehavioral marker to be roughly in about the 4 to 7 years before cognitive impairment. And so it is a working model. We certainly hope to revise this and to examine other biomarkers in addition to social determinants of health to look at how they ultimately impact driving itself. I lied, that was not the last slide. This is the last slide. And so I've inundated you with a lot of statistics, a lot of data, verbiage, and so I just want to briefly summarize them with a couple of images. So we know that roughly 95% of the landmass of the United States is considered to be rural, but only 20% of the US population resides within those rural areas. And as you can imagine, with the growth in population, it's only logical that the population will spread from urban and suburban areas into more rural areas. This means more roads, more infrastructure, and more dependency on human driving. It is not going away anytime soon. Some of this work certainly may not help millions of older adults, especially those that don't drive, because they depend on public or private transportation. But transportation is literally and figuratively the vehicle for supporting our daily life. And I would argue that it's even more crucial for us as we get older. With respect to the many social determinants of health framework, there are a number of factors that impact transportation, like cognitive function, depression, neuropsychiatric symptoms. Those are studies I didn't have a chance to speak to. But over the past 8 years, we've worked to really shift how driving performance is evaluated in controlled settings, to using big data and biomarker data to quantify and characterize change and decline, and also to look at intra-individual change over time. Just like with observational studies and clinical trials, we need to be more effortful with diversifying our samples and also focusing more on those social determinants of health. And we also argue that aging research needs to move beyond paper and pencil tests to include functional outcomes. And so I want to connect this last half of the talk to the first half, but health disparities certainly do shift the onus, from the individual to recognizing the social and economic obstacles that are fundamental barriers to health. The current state of our health as we are all aging right now is inextricably linked to history. Concepts like redlining, racial and ethnic groups, the forced sovereignty of tribal nations, making illegal for women and minorities to vote, all lead the seeds and for many decades that bore the fruit that is health disparities as we see it today. And you might say there are amendments and policies that protect the rights of people. And I would say what is written, but what also is put into practice are two different things. Unless, unlike what you might read in a history book, systematic practices of oppression continue in different ways to date. I hope that you were able to see how they're sort of represented with some of the studies that I showed earlier. And a lot of the biases with some of the work we're doing right now is we're not engaging that representation. But it's really up to us to sort of be agents of that change, because while justice might be blind, we know that science is not. So with that said, I apologize for running over the clock, but I will take any questions you have, and I'm happy to stay afterwards.
All right, thank you so much. That was an incredible talk, Dr. Babulal. I've got maybe 15 questions of my own that I would love to ask you, but maybe I'll hold off on that and we can catch up later, just in favor of opening it up to the other attendees. Are there any questions for Ganesh? He covered a lot of data, a lot of different topics. Does anybody want to follow up? Feel free to unmute yourselves.